The Oklahoma wind carried dust and regret in equal measure that autumn morning. Jackson Reeves stood at the edge of an open grave watching a casket descend into red clay soil. The priest's words about service and sacrifice dissolved into the air like morning fog burning off asphalt. 30 people scattered among the headstones kept their distance from the biker in worn leather standing alone on the far side of the plot. Marcus Webb had served 3 decades as Riverside County Sheriff before retirement claimed him at 73. The obituary in the Tulsa World called him a pillar of law enforcement. It mentioned commendations and community service. It said nothing about the photograph Jax held in his calloused hand. He waited until the crowd dispersed before approaching the grave. The photo showed a girl of 12 with dark eyes that had seen too much. Jax dropped it face down onto the mahogany lid before the groundskeepers could start their work. No one asked what it was. No one wanted to know. The drive back to Millbrook took 2 hours through country that hadn't changed in 50 years. Wheat fields gave way to scrub oak. Small towns appeared and vanished in the rearview mirror of his pickup truck. The radio played nothing but static between stations. 3 years had passed since the rescue. 8 before that in a federal prison cell. 5 more on parole that felt like wearing an ankle monitor made of time itself. 13 years total since a 6-year-old walked into his garage and changed everything he thought he understood about justice. The speedometer held steady at 65. Jax's hands rested light on the wheel the way they'd taught him in the Marines 30 years back. Keep your grip loose. Stay ready. Don't fight what you can't control. His phone buzzed against the passenger seat. A text from Danny asking when he'd be back at the clubhouse. Jax left it unanswered. Some conversations required presence, not pixels. The memory arrived unbidden as miles of asphalt disappeared beneath worn tires. Summer heat shimmering off concrete. The smell of motor oil and cut grass. Radio playing low in an empty garage while his hands worked on a carburetor that had seen better decades. She'd appeared in the doorway like a ghost made flesh, backlit by June's sun, so he couldn't see her face at first. Just a small silhouette in a torn dress holding something against her chest. Jax had frozen with a wrench in his hand. Kids didn't wander into Big Iron territory. Parents told their children the bikers were dangerous men who'd done terrible things. Most of it was reputation built on leather and tattoos. Some of it was earned. The girl took 3 steps forward into shadow where he could see her properly. Blonde hair and braids coming undone. Dirt smudges across a pink dress with flowers. Bare feet on oil-stained concrete. She clutched a stuffed rabbit with one ear nearly torn off. His first thought was lost. His second was wrong. The bruises on her inner thighs were fingerprint-shaped and fresh. More on her upper arms in patterns that spoke of being held down. Her legs didn't quite track right when she walked. The kind of gait that came from pain in places 6-year-olds shouldn't hurt. Jax had seen plenty in Fallujah that woke him at 3 in the morning for years after. But nothing prepared him for the way this child looked at him with eyes that belonged to someone 3 times her age. He'd set the wrench down carefully, wiped his hands on a rag, crouched low so he wouldn't tower over her. You lost, little one. The girl studied him with that ancient gaze. Are you the bad bikers? Some folks think so. What do you think? Bad people don't fix things. You fix motorcycles. The logic surprised him. That's pretty smart. What's your name? Lily, I need help. Those 3 words carried weight that pressed against his chest like a physical force. He could see it in the way she held herself. The careful positioning that kept pressure off damaged tissue. The trembling that had nothing to do with cold despite the 90-degree heat. I hurt, down there, and my legs won't close right. Jax's stomach dropped through the concrete floor. He'd known before she spoke, known from the bruises and the walk and the age in her eyes. But hearing it made real in her small voice turned knowledge into a stone in his gut that would never fully dissolve. Who hurt you, Lily? Deputy Ethan. But I can't tell. He said he'll hurt Mama if I tell. He said nobody believes bad girls. The rage came then, not hot and explosive like in his younger days. Cold and calculating like mission planning in the desert. The kind that made decisions with consequences measured in decades, not moments. You're not bad, Lily, and I believe you. Her face transformed. The ancient eyes filled with something that might have been hope or might have been the last desperate grasp before drowning. Either way, it was unbearable to witness. The present reasserted itself as Jax took the exit toward Millbrook. Population 8,400. The sign still claimed that number despite half the storefronts on Main Street sitting empty behind dusty windows. Big Iron Motorcycle Club occupied a converted warehouse on the eastern edge where sidewalks gave up and gravel took over. The building's metal siding had faded from red to something between rust and dried blood. A hand-painted sign announced the club's name in letters that could barely be read anymore. 3 bikes sat in the parking lot, down from 6 when Jax went inside 13 years ago, down from 8 before Preacher's lungs gave out. The mathematics of aging made themselves known in empty spaces and missing voices. Danny emerged from the bay door wiping grease from his hands with a rag that might have been white in a previous decade. At 39, he carried responsibility in the set of his shoulders that hadn't been there at 19 when Jax first taught him how to rebuild a carburetor. How was it? Jax killed the engine, like burying a man who spent 30 years protecting the wrong people. Danny nodded, asked what needed to be asked next without words. His eyes moved to the cab of the truck, checking for something Jax might have brought back from the funeral. Just dropped a photo in the grave. Girl named Kayla. First victim anybody knows about. Webb knew about her. Webb gave the deputy who hurt her a clean transfer and a fresh start, then did it 8 more times over 15 years. They moved into the garage where afternoon light cut through gaps in the walls, creating bars of illumination across concrete and chrome. The space smelled like it always had. Motor oil and old leather, and the particular mustiness that came from inadequate ventilation in Oklahoma summers. Marcus Davis worked on a panhead in the corner. At 61, Hammer moved slower than he used to, but with the same methodical precision. He'd been there the night of the rescue, spent 4 months waiting to see if they'd all go down for it. Preacher's empty workbench sat covered with a tarp in the back. No one had touched it since the funeral 2 years prior. Some absences demanded acknowledgement through preservation. Jax grabbed a beer from the cooler that had been in service since the 90s. The metal was dented and the insulation mostly theoretical, but it kept things cool enough. He popped the cap and took a long pull before speaking. Started thinking about it on the drive back. How many kids got hurt because good men convinced themselves predators deserve second chances? Danny set his rag aside. FBI said 47 victims they could verify. Could be more. Could always be more. That's what makes it worse. Every transfer Webb approved. Every reference letter he wrote. Every time he chose protecting his boys over protecting children. The numbers just kept adding up. Hammer straightened from the engine he'd been working on. His hands were stained black from years of mechanical work, and nothing would ever get them fully clean again. Emma says she's bringing my grandson by next week. Kid's 8 now. Can't imagine someone hurting him like that. The thought hung in the air between them. None of them could imagine it. But 47 families hadn't needed to imagine. They lived it while men in positions of authority looked the other way or actively helped cover tracks. Jax moved to the wall where 14 drawings hung in cheap frames. Crayon renderings of a motorcycle and a man with a beard and a small girl with a stuffed rabbit. They chronicled years of healing through evolving artistic skill. The early ones were crude stick figures. The later ones showed perspective and shading. Below them, a graduation photo showed Lily Morrison Roberts at 18 in cap and gown. Beside that, an article clipped from the University of Oklahoma student paper about a social work major with ambitious plans to reform child protective services from the inside. You think she'll actually change anything? Danny's question didn't expect an answer. They all knew systems protected themselves first and people second. But Jax had learned that sometimes one person in the right position at the right moment could shift trajectories in ways that rippled forward through time. She's got 13 years of my life invested in making sure she gets the chance to try. The beer was warm and flat. Jax drank it anyway. Waste was a sin learned young and never fully unlearned. His phone buzzed again. Same question from Danny, now standing 10 feet away, asking when he'd be back. Jax pulled out the device and showed him the screen. Danny's mouth twitched in something that might have been a smile on someone who still remembered how. Could have just asked in person. Wanted to make sure you were actually coming back. You've been distant since the parole ended. The observation was accurate. 5 years of supervised release meant 5 years of staying away from the club. No association with known criminals, even if those criminals were brothers who'd stood beside him when it mattered most. The restriction had ended 6 months ago, but habits formed in restriction took time to break. Relearning how to be free was harder than learning how to be locked up had been. The afternoon bled into evening. They worked on bikes with the kind of comfortable silence that came from decades of shared experience. Radio played classic rock at low volume. Someone had tuned it to the same station they'd been listening to since the 90s. Darkness brought mosquitoes and the decision to call it for the day. Hammer left first, appointment with Emma and his grandson for dinner. The relationship had taken years to rebuild after he'd beaten his daughter's abuser badly enough to require a hospital stay and earned himself a felony assault conviction. Some wounds healed. Others just learned to live with scar tissue. Danny lingered after Hammer's taillight disappeared down the gravel road. He pulled 2 more beers from the cooler and handed one to Jax without asking if he wanted it. The assumption of shared ritual was its own form of communication. How much did it cost you? Really? Jax considered the question while condensation formed on the bottle in his hand. The numbers were easy. 13 years, ages 48 to 61, prime earning years spent in prison and parole, body broken from hard time and harder work, no retirement saved, no family started, no comfort built. Everything I had and some things I didn't know I needed until they were gone. Was it worth it? The question everyone asked eventually. Prosecutors and parole boards, and reporters and strangers who recognized him from news coverage that had gone viral for 3 weeks before the next outrage claimed headlines. Even Lily had asked once across a table in a supervised visit when she was 14 and trying to understand adult choices through teenage comprehension. She's alive. That's all the math that matters. Danny nodded slowly. He'd been 19 when Lily walked into the garage. Barely more than a prospect learning to rebuild engines and follow orders. Now he carried the weight of keeping Big Iron alive as membership aged and recruitment dried up. The world had changed. Brotherhood meant something different to younger generations. They wanted community without commitment, connection without consequence. The idea of sacrificing 13 years for anyone seemed alien to men who measured loyalty in likes and shares. You ever regret it? Every day I was inside, every parole meeting where they asked if I'd do it again, and I had to choose between lying for freedom and telling truth that kept me locked up. Every time I couldn't attend a funeral or wedding or just a Tuesday afternoon working on bikes with my brothers. Jax paused, drained the beer, set the empty bottle on a workbench scarred with decades of use. But I never regretted saving her, and I'd pay it all again if the price bought the same result. The conversation ended there. Some things didn't require elaboration. Danny headed for his own bike in the small apartment he rented above a closed pawn shop downtown. Jax watched the taillight disappear before turning back to the empty garage. Lily's drawings caught his eye again. He moved closer, studying the progression. The shaky early attempts at rendering human figures. The gradual improvement as motor skills developed and trauma began its slow recession. The final one showed genuine artistic talent emerging from therapeutic necessity. His phone buzzed, this time from a number he recognized. Karen Roberts, Lily's adoptive mother. The woman who'd taken in a damaged 6-year-old and spent 12 years helping her heal one day at a time. The text was brief. Lily wanted to know if Jax could come to Thanksgiving dinner. She was bringing her boyfriend, wanted Jax to meet him. The request was ordinary, the kind of thing that happened in normal families all the time. But nothing about their situation had ever been normal, and pretending otherwise felt dishonest. Jax typed a response, said he'd be honored, hit send before he could second-guess the decision. The drive to his apartment took 15 minutes through streets he'd known for 3 decades, past the diner where waitresses still served him but never made small talk, past Murphy's Auto Supply where Randy had stopped refusing service but never recovered warmth, past the elementary school where Lily had attended 3rd through 5th grade after the adoption went through. Millbrook wore its history in layers like sediment. You could read the town's decline in shuttered businesses and faded paint. Economic forces had pulled opportunity elsewhere, leaving behind those too stubborn or too poor to follow. The apartment complex had been old when Jax moved in 6 months ago. Now it just looked older. Paint peeled from window frames. Cracked asphalt parking lots sprouted weeds through expanding fissures. His unit was on the 2nd floor facing west, so summer afternoons turned it into an oven. Inside was 800 square feet of basic function, kitchen with appliances from the 80s, bathroom with tile that had been white once, living room with a couch acquired from a thrift store, and a television bought new because even used ones cost almost as much. The walls were bare except for Lily's drawings. He'd made copies before hanging the originals at the clubhouse. These reproductions were taped directly to drywall in chronological order, a visual timeline of healing rendered in crayon and colored pencil and eventually acrylic paint. Jax microwaved a frozen dinner and ate standing at the kitchen counter. The food was terrible but adequate, nutrition delivered efficiently without requiring thought or effort. He'd learned in prison that meals were fuel first and pleasure distant second, if at all. The television played news coverage he didn't watch while he cleaned his plate in the sink. Force of habit from a time when leaving dishes for later could mean missing count or violating some arbitrary rule that bought you a week in segregation. His phone showed 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize. No voicemail. Probably reporters still looking for quotes about Webb's death. The story had made regional news because former sheriff's suicide note had gone viral 3 years ago when family published it. The note itself had been brutal in its honesty. Webb cataloging his failures and the children who'd paid for them, naming names, accepting responsibility without asking forgiveness because he understood some acts live beyond pardon. Jax had respected that much at least. The willingness to name what he'd done and refuse to hide behind institutional loyalty or plausible deniability. Webb had protected predators, 47 verified victims, with probably more never identified. And when he finally understood the full weight of that choice, he'd removed himself from a world he'd made worse by being in it. The math was complicated. Webb had been a good cop by most measures, solved murders, put away rapists and thieves, served his community with dedication that earned commendations and respect. But he'd also given 9 predators second chances that became hunting licenses. And in the final accounting, those 9 had mattered more than everything else combined. Jack sat on the thrift store couch and let exhaustion pull him toward sleep. His body ached in ways it hadn't at 40. Prison aged you fast, and work afterward kept the process accelerating. Knees that protested stairs. Back that locked up if he sat wrong. Hands with arthritis settling into joints that had been broken and healed poorly over decades of fighting and mechanical work. At 61, he was old by biker standards. Most of his generation were dead or locked up or had aged out into respectable retirement. The ones still riding were rare enough to draw attention. Gray beards and leather vests marking them as relics from an era the world had mostly forgotten. Sleep came hard as it usually did. His mind wouldn't settle. Thoughts circled back to the funeral and Webb's grave and the photograph of Kayla Hastings, who'd been 12 when her childhood ended at the hands of a deputy sheriff who should have protected her. That had been 8 years before Lily. 8 years of additional victims because Webb had chosen loyalty over justice. Because he'd believed in second chances and rehabilitation for men who'd proven themselves irredeemable through actions that destroyed children. The next morning brought Saturday heat that had August written all through it, despite the calendar claiming September. Jax woke at 5 from habit established in prison and never broken. The world outside was still dark. He made coffee in a pot that had been expensive once and now just worked. The plan for the day was simple. Work on his bike, maybe drive out to the clubhouse if Danny needed help with something. Avoid thinking about funerals and photographs and all the ways good intentions paved roads to terrible places. But plans had a way of dissolving when 6-year-old ghosts walked through garage doors on bare feet holding stuffed rabbits. The memory wouldn't release him today. Lily standing in that doorway. The way sunlight had backlit her creating silhouette before she stepped forward into shadow where bruises became visible. The wrongness of her gait. The age in her eyes. Jax had known what he was seeing before she spoke. Had understood the implications immediately. And in that moment, he'd faced a choice that would define the next 13 years and probably the rest of his life, however long that lasted. He could send her away, tell her to go home and talk to her mother, call the authorities through proper channels, do everything by the book and trust the system to protect her. Or he could believe what his eyes showed him and his gut confirmed, that this child had already tried proper channels, that the system had already failed her, That Deputy Ethan Cross had been protected by institutional authority and small-town assumptions about who deserved belief. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint. Jax drank it black while standing at the kitchen window, watching dawn paint the sky in shades of amber and rust. Somewhere out there, Lily Morrison Roberts was probably still asleep in a dorm room at University of Oklahoma, probably dreaming dreams that didn't wake her screaming anymore. 13 years of his life for her chance at normal. The exchange rate seemed reasonable. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Davis, Hammer asking if Jax wanted to grab breakfast at the diner before heading to the clubhouse. The invitation was casual but carried weight. Reintegration into brotherhood happened in small gestures and shared meals. Jax texted back affirmative. 20 minutes to shower and dress. The routine was familiar. Jeans worn soft from years of use. T-shirt with a logo from a motorcycle rally that had happened before Lily was born. Leather vest with big iron patches marking him as member and officer. The vest had waited in a storage unit through 8 years of prison and 5 of parole. Putting it on again 6 months ago had felt like reclaiming skin that had been borrowed by someone else. The diner occupied a building that predated air conditioning. Ceiling fans moved humid air in lazy circles. Vinyl booths held memories of decades of coffee and gossip. The same waitress who'd served him in his 20s now worked the morning shift with gray hair and varicose veins. She didn't smile when she poured coffee, but she poured it. Progress came in small increments. Hammer sat in the back booth with a view of the door. Old habits from Iraq, where watching approaches had meant staying alive. He'd ordered already, pancakes and eggs, and enough bacon to violate several dietary recommendations. Jax slid into the opposite side. Accepted coffee from the waitress, whose name he'd never learned despite 30 years of occasional service. Emma's bringing Tyler by the clubhouse this afternoon. Thought you might want to meet him. The invitation surprised him. Hammer had been cautious about mixing his MC life with his family life. The separation made sense given history. Given that the last time he tried to protect his daughter, it had cost him 2 years inside and nearly cost him her forever. I'd like that. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the scrape of forks on plates and the distant murmur of other conversations. The food was adequate. Hash browns crispy, eggs over easy done properly, toast with butter pooling in the center. Halfway through the meal, Hammer set down his fork and met Jax's eyes with the directness that came from shared combat experience. You think about what happens next, after Thanksgiving, after meeting boyfriends and playing nice with families. The question touched on something Jax had been avoiding. He was 61 with no prospects beyond minimum wage mechanical work. Body breaking down, no retirement saved, Social Security years away and inadequate when it arrived. The math of old age without resources was brutal in its simplicity. Haven't thought much past next month. Might want to start. We're not getting younger and this life doesn't come with pensions. The observation was accurate and uncomfortable. Bikers aged poorly, too much hard living and insufficient planning. Most ended up working until bodies gave out entirely. Then came dependence on family or charity or state services designed to warehouse the elderly poor until death released budgets for the next desperate case. Jax pushed eggs around his plate. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a particular frequency that signaled aging ballasts. Everything here was old and getting older, including him. What do you want me to say? That I should have taken the plea deal that didn't include prison time, should have cooperated against Ethan and walked free while Lily went back into the system. Hammer held up a hand. Not saying that. Never saying that. You did right thing and paid hard price for it. I'm asking what comes after. When you're 70 and can't work anymore. When the body gives out completely. The future stretched ahead like highway disappearing into heat shimmer. Uncertain and probably uncomfortable. Jax had never been good at planning beyond the next mission. The Marines had broken him of long-term thinking, and prison had finished the job. I'll figure it out when I get there. Hammer nodded slowly, started to say something else, then stopped. Some conversations didn't have conclusions, just acknowledgments that problems existed without solutions. They finished eating, split the check despite Hammer's protest, left a tip that was probably too generous but felt necessary. The waitress collected plates without comment or thanks. Another interaction in a town that remembered but didn't forgive. The clubhouse was 15 minutes away. They rode separately. Jax on his panhead that had been old when he bought it in the 90s and was now approaching classic status through pure survival. Hammer on a newer Harley that made concerning sounds suggesting expensive problems in the near future. Danny was already there working on the electrical system of a Sportster that belonged to a guy who paid in cash and asked no questions when the work took longer than estimated. The informal economy of mechanical repair kept the club solvent, if not prosperous. Tyler Morrison arrived with his grandmother an hour later. 8 years old with the kind of energy that came from youth and good nutrition. He bounded into the garage like it was an adventure destination instead of a warehouse full of old men and older motorcycles. Hammer introduced his grandson with obvious pride. The boy shook hands with solemn formality that someone had taught him. Probably Emma trying to instill manners that would carry him through a world that judged character by superficial compliance. Tyler's attention immediately fixed on the drawings covering one wall. He moved closer, studying them with the intense focus children brought to things adults had learned to gloss over. Did a kid draw these? Jax joined him by the wall. His knees protested the movement, but he ignored them. Pain was background noise you learned to work around. Girl named Lily. She was 6 when she started. 18 when she did the last one. Tyler traced a finger over one of the early drawings. The crude stick figures barely recognizable as human forms. Why'd she draw so many motorcycles? Because motorcycles represented the people who helped her when nobody else would. The answer was too complex for 8-year-old comprehension, but Tyler seemed to sense the weight behind it. He nodded seriously and moved to the next drawing in the sequence. Is she still around? She's in college now, studying to help other kids who need help. That's cool. The simplicity of childhood judgment. Cool or not cool. Binary assessment of worth without the complications adults layered onto every interaction. Emma appeared in the doorway. At 43, she carried herself with the careful composure of someone who'd learned to manage anxiety through rigid self-control. Her relationship with her father had taken years to rebuild and remained fragile in ways neither acknowledged directly. Tyler, we need to go. Your dad's expecting us for dinner. The boy protested with the universal whine of children being pulled away from interesting discoveries. Emma remained firm. Boundaries established through consistency, not volume. Hammer walked them to the car. Jax watched through the bay door as grandfather hugged grandson with the kind of careful affection that came from fearing rejection. Tyler returned the embrace unself-consciously. 8 was still young enough for physical affection to feel normal. Emma drove away with Tyler waving through the rear window until the car turned onto the main road and disappeared behind trees. Hammer returned to the garage moving slower than when he'd left it. The interaction had cost him something emotionally. Jax recognized the signs from his own encounters with Lily. The fear that each meeting might be the last. That fragile connections could snap without warning, leaving only absence. He's a good kid, takes after his mother. The compliment landed with weight Hammer felt visibly. His shoulders straightened slightly. Pride mixed with regret for years lost to poor choices and worse consequences. Danny killed the radio that had been playing background music nobody was listening to. The silence felt purposeful. 3 men in a garage with motorcycles in various states of disassembly. The kind of scene that had played out here for 30 years, with only the specific individuals changing. Been thinking about Webb's funeral. About what you said regarding second chances. Jax waited. Danny didn't speak without purpose. How many of us would be here if someone hadn't given us second chances? You got arrested for that bar fight. Hammer did 2 years for assault. I've got a record from my 20s. We've all got past that decent people would say disqualify us from polite society. The observation was accurate. Big Iron had always attracted men with histories. Veterans who came back wrong. Workers displaced by economic forces beyond their control. Anyone who didn't quite fit in respectable frameworks. Difference is we didn't rape children. We made mistakes, got in fights, did stupid things, but there's a line between that and what Ethan Cross did. Danny nodded. I know. I'm just saying, the math isn't as simple as bad people don't deserve chances. It's about what they did and whether they can actually change. Jax moved to his workbench. Started organizing tools that didn't need organizing. The motion gave his hands something to do while his mind worked through complications he'd been avoiding. Webb believed predators could rehabilitate. He was wrong, but the belief came from somewhere, from seeing people turn their lives around, from wanting to believe in redemption. So where's the line? How do you know who deserves a second chance and who's just going to hurt more people? The question had no good answer. Jax had spent years thinking about it in a cell where time moved like cold honey, had discussed it with other inmates, with guards, with himself during hours when sleep wouldn't come, and darkness made honest examination unavoidable. You look at the nature of the harm. Theft can be about desperation, assault can be about poor impulse control, but predators who target children, that's not a mistake. That's calculated evil that knows what it's doing and chooses to do it anyway. Danny absorbed this, started to respond, stopped when headlights swept across the garage entrance. The vehicle was a sedan with government plates. Two people emerged, man and woman in business casual that marked them as federal employees who'd learned to dress down for field work without quite managing casual. The woman approached first, mid-30s with the kind of purposeful stride that came from authority backed by institutional weight. She pulled credentials from her jacket and held them at comfortable reading distance. Special Agent Lauren Kim, FBI. This is Special Agent Michael Torres. We'd like to speak with Jackson Reeves. Jack set down the wrench he'd been holding, wiped his hands on a rag that redistributed grease more than removed it. I'm Reeves. We're investigating the circumstances surrounding Sheriff Marcus Webb's death, specifically allegations in his suicide note regarding multiple transfers of deputies with abuse complaints. Your name appears in our files related to the Ethan Cross case. The Ethan Cross case. As if 13 years of his life could be reduced to a file number in case designation. What do you need from me? Agent Kim glanced at Danny and Hammer. The unspoken request was clear. This conversation would happen with or without audience, but preference was for privacy. Danny caught Jax's eye, got a nod. He and Hammer moved toward the far end of the garage, giving space while remaining technical at present. Brotherhood meant backup, even in conversations. We're building a comprehensive case about institutional failures in child protection. Webb's note named 9 deputies he helped transfer. We've identified 47 victims. Your testimony regarding how Lily Morrison came to you could help establish pattern of system failure. Jax had given this testimony before. To local police who didn't believe him, to FBI during the initial investigation, to prosecutors preparing the case against Ethan, to the parole board every year for 5 years. Each telling required reliving details he'd rather leave buried. I've told this story enough times. It's all in your files. Agent Torres spoke for the first time. His voice carried traces of an accent that suggested California origins. Files don't capture everything. We need to understand how a decorated officer maintained access to victims for years despite multiple complaints. Because people like Webb chose institutional loyalty over children's safety. Because small towns protect their own, even when their own are monsters. Because a badge carries more weight than a 6-year-old's testimony. The words came out harder than Jax intended. Agent Kim didn't flinch. That's what we're trying to change. But we need cooperation from people who saw the system fail firsthand. Jax leaned against his workbench. The metal was cool through his shirt. Solid in a conversation that felt like it might drift into territory he'd spent years trying to leave behind. What specifically do you need? We want you to testify before a Senate subcommittee investigating institutional protection of predators in law enforcement. Your case became high-profile enough to generate national discussion. Your testimony could provide human context for policy recommendations. The request landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spreading outward in ways he couldn't fully predict. Testifying meant publicity, meant reopening wounds that had scarred over, if not healed. Meant Lily's story being told again to strangers who'd reduce it to talking points and political leverage. I'll need to think about it. Agent Kim produced a business card from her jacket, handed it to him with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. We understand this is difficult, but 47 verified victims deserve systemic change that might prevent the next 47. Your testimony could help make that happen. They left the same way they'd arrived, professional, efficient, carrying the weight of institutional authority that could compel cooperation if necessary, but preferred voluntary participation. Danny and Hammer returned from their strategic distance. Neither spoke. The question hung in the air between them, obvious enough to not require voicing. Jax turned the business card over in his hands. Lauren Kim, special agent, direct line, email address. The machinery of federal investigation reduced to embossed lettering on cream cardstock. She's not wrong about the 47 victims. Hammer crossed his arms. Question is whether putting yourself through that again actually helps anyone or just gives politicians something to pontificate about during election years. The cynicism was earned. They'd all watched enough political theater to know sincerity was optional and results negotiable. But dismissing every attempt at change because some attempts failed felt like surrender to inevitability. I'll think about it. The conversation ended there. They returned to work on bikes that needed attention, physical labor that produced visible results. Straightforward cause and effect without the complications of systemic reform and institutional change. Evening brought the decision to close up. Danny had a date with someone he'd met through an app. The concept still seemed foreign to Jax. Romance mediated through algorithms and profile pictures. But the world had moved on during his 13 years of forced disconnection. Hammer left shortly after. Saturday night dinner with Emma and Tyler. The weekly ritual that rebuilt relationship through consistent presence. Jax remained alone in the garage watching sunset paint the sky in shades that reminded him of the desert. Fallujah had sunsets like this, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The kind of beauty that made you forget for a moment that people were dying in streets where those same colors reflected off pools of blood. He pulled out his phone, opened the text from Karen Roberts about Thanksgiving, typed a response asking if Lily would mind if he brought something to contribute to the meal. Felt stupid asking, deleted it, sent simple acceptance instead. The drive home took him past landmarks that marked time through decay. The movie theater that had closed when streaming made it obsolete. The mall that had been dying since the 90s and finally expired during his incarceration. The high school where Lily had graduated valedictorian 3 years ago. His apartment was dark and hot. He opened windows that didn't catch breeze and turned on fans that moved humid air in circles without cooling it. Made dinner from a can heated on a stove. Ate standing at the counter because sitting required motivation he couldn't summon. The drawings on his wall caught his eye. 14 reproductions chronicling 12 years of healing. He'd watched Lily create most of these during supervised visits, watched her artistic skill develop alongside psychological recovery, watched ancient eyes gradually remember how to look young. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. He almost deleted it unread. Spam and scams came in waves, but something made him check. Mr. Jax, this is Lily. Got your number from Mom. Wanted to say thanks for coming to Thanksgiving. Also wanted to ask if you'd be willing to talk to my social work ethics class about your experience with the system. Professor said you could zoom in if driving to campus is too far. No pressure, just thought it might help students understand real-world implications of policy. The request was unexpected and complicated. Speaking to college students about the worst moments of his life, about decisions that had cost him 13 years, about a system that failed so completely, one man breaking multiple laws was the only path to keeping a child alive. But Lily was asking, and in the 13 years since that June afternoon when she'd walked into his garage on bare feet, he'd never been able to tell her no when it mattered. He typed a response, said he'd be honored. Hit send before doubt could intervene. Her reply came immediately, 3 words and an emoji. Thank you, heart. The simple expression of gratitude carried weight that pressed against his chest. Lily had thanked him before. At the hospital before they took her into foster care. During supervised visits when she was learning to process trauma. At her graduation when she'd hugged him in front of 200 people who'd come to watch her succeed. But this felt different. Adult recognition of childhood salvation. Understanding deepened by years and education and perspective that only time could provide. Jack set his phone on the counter, moved to the window, watched the street below where sparse traffic moved between destinations. Saturday night in a town that had forgotten how to be young. Somewhere in a dorm room or apartment, Lily was probably studying, probably preparing for classes that would teach her theories she'd already learned through experience, probably thinking about a future where she'd help children the system failed the way it had failed her. And somewhere in Texarkana Federal Correctional Institution, Ethan Cross was dying by inches in protective custody. 7 consecutive life sentences. No possibility of parole. No future beyond concrete and steel. And the knowledge that every prisoner with access to him wanted him dead. The mathematics of justice were complicated. Ethan would die in prison. Webb had died by his own hand. Chief Hayes had lasted 4 years before a heart attack took him. Dispatcher Diane Martinez served 6 and got out to a life where her own children wouldn't speak to her. But 47 victims still lived with what had been done to them. Some thrived like Lily, some struggled. 7 had died by suicide or overdose. The final accounting remained incomplete and probably always would. Jax pulled Agent Kim's business card from his pocket, studied it in the dim light of his apartment. Senate testimony, national platform, chance to influence policy that might protect children decades from now, or political theater that accomplished nothing beyond reopening wounds for public consumption. The decision felt heavier than it should. He'd faced enemy fire in Fallujah, spent 8 years in federal prison, survived 5 more on parole. But the thought of sitting before cameras and politicians talking about Lily's bruises and the system's failures made his hands shake. He set the card on the counter beside his phone. Tomorrow's problem. Tonight he just needed to get through another evening alone with memories that wouldn't settle and a future that refused to take shape. Sleep came eventually, restless and fragmentary. Dreams that mixed desert sand with Oklahoma clay. Faces of men he'd killed in combat blending with faces of men who'd killed children in suburbs. Lily's voice asking for help echoing across years and distance. He woke at 3, couldn't fall back to sleep. Made coffee and sat in darkness, waiting for dawn. The sun rose on Sunday with heat that promised afternoon storms. Jack showered and dressed, no plans beyond existing through hours until Monday brought work at the garage. His phone showed a missed call from Margaret Sullivan, his lawyer from 13 years ago who'd built the necessity defense that ultimately kept him from serving the full 27-year exposure. She'd gone on to make partner at a firm in Oklahoma City, still took his calls when he needed legal advice about parole requirements or background check complications. He called back, got voicemail, left message saying he'd received FBI contact about Senate testimony and wanted her opinion on risks versus benefits. The rest of the day dissolved into routine maintenance, laundry and machines that barely agitated, grocery shopping at a store that had replaced the one he remembered. Everything familiar but shifted slightly, like returning to a childhood home and finding furniture rearranged. Monday brought work. The garage where he'd been employed for 6 months occupied a strip mall between a dollar store and a closed dry cleaner. His boss was a Vietnam vet named Carl, who'd hired him to knowing that his record because Carl had one too. The work was simple. Oil changes, brake jobs, replacing parts on vehicles held together by hope and inadequate maintenance budgets. It paid $14 an hour, enough for rent and food and little else. Carl appeared mid-morning with coffee and a question about whether Jax could work overtime Thursday. Someone had called in sick and they had more jobs than mechanics. Jax said yes. Overtime meant time and a half. Every extra hour pushed back the date when age would make work impossible and finances would become existential crisis. Lunch was a sandwich from a convenience store eaten standing beside his toolbox. Quick fueling between jobs. The afternoon brought a transmission that needed rebuilding and would take 3 days minimum. He was elbow deep in gears when Carl stuck his head in. Someone asking for you out front. Jax wiped his hands, followed Carl through the garage, found Agent Kim waiting beside a sedan that probably cost more than he'd make in 2 years. Mr. Reeves, sorry to bother you at work. Wanted to follow up on our conversation. The apology felt pro forma, but he accepted it with a nod. Customers in the waiting area tried not to stare at the obvious federal agent in their neighborhood garage. I talked to my lawyer, still waiting to hear back. Understood. But there's a time element. Senate subcommittee meets in 3 weeks. We need confirmed witnesses by end of week to finalize the schedule. 3 weeks. Not enough time to prepare emotionally. Too much time to dread inevitability. What exactly would the testimony involve? Agent Kim pulled a folder from her vehicle, handed it to him. Inside were documents outlining format and expected questions. Panel of senators, C-SPAN coverage, written testimony submitted in advance, verbal Q&A following. Your testimony would focus on system failures that allowed Ethan Cross to continue victimizing children despite multiple red flags. We'd also cover Webb's role in facilitating transfers and the broader pattern of institutional protection. Everything Jax wanted to forget formatted for political consumption. I'll give you an answer by Wednesday. Agent Kim nodded, handed him another business card even though he still had the first one. Insurance against loss or forgetfulness. Federal thoroughness applied to recruiting witnesses. She drove away. Jax returned to the transmission rebuild, hands moving through familiar motions while his mind circled questions without answers. That evening brought a call from Margaret Sullivan. Her voice carried the brisk efficiency of a lawyer billing by the 6-minute increment, but making time because history mattered. Senate testimony is low risk legally. You're not being investigated. You're being asked to provide expert perspective on systemic failures. Could actually help with employment complications going forward. Shows you're engaged in reform efforts. The practical analysis was helpful, but skirted the emotional cost. Margaret caught the silence. But it's going to be hard, talking about it publicly, having politicians use your experience as talking points. Media coverage that brings everything back. Hard was relative. 13 years had been hard. This was just uncomfortable. I'll probably do it. Margaret paused. When she spoke again, the billing timer in her voice had shut off. This was friend talking, not attorney. Make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. If it's because you think you owe something or because Lily asked, those are complicated motivations. But if you genuinely believe it might help prevent the next 47 victims, that's solid ground. The advice was sound. Jax thanked her, ended the call, sat in his apartment watching the television play programs he wasn't watching. Tuesday brought text from Lily, just checking in, making sure you didn't forget about Thanksgiving. Her boyfriend's name is Michael. He's studying pre-med. Little nervous about you meeting him, but excited too. The casual disclosure of nervousness made Jack smile. The idea that meeting a 61-year-old biker who'd served time for kidnapping might make a pre-med student nervous seemed reasonable. He responded that he was looking forward to it, asked what he should bring. She suggested nothing, but if he insisted, maybe rolls from the bakery on Oak Street. The exchange was ordinary, the kind of thing that happened in families all the time. But nothing about their relationship had ever been ordinary, and the normalcy felt like gift and burden simultaneously. Wednesday morning, Jax called Agent Kim. Left voicemail saying he'd testify. The decision felt inevitable. Lily had asked him to speak to her class. The FBI had asked him to speak to senators. Both requests aimed at the same goal, making systems better so fewer children fell through gaps. Agent Kim called back within an hour, relief evident in her voice. Logistics followed. Travel arrangements, hotel accommodation, per diem. All the machinery of federal bureaucracy mobilized to get him to Washington, D.C. in 3 weeks. He hung up feeling like he'd committed to something larger than he understood. The weight of institutional attention pressing down, cameras and questions and strangers judging choices made in moments of crisis. But Lily had walked 2 miles on bare feet because nobody else would help her. The least he could do was sit in an uncomfortable chair and answer questions from people who'd never faced that kind of failure. Thursday's overtime turned into 10 hours of brake jobs and tire rotations. His back screamed by hour 8. Knees protested through hour 9. But the paycheck would be larger, and that mattered when margins were measured and whether groceries lasted until the next check. Friday brought a package via certified mail. Inside was the formal request for Senate testimony, official letterhead. His name spelled correctly, which suggested someone had done research. Scheduled date and time. Contact information for the committee staffer coordinating witnesses. Also included was a briefing document about the other witnesses. 3 parents of victims, 2 former CPS workers who tried to report concerns, 1 prosecutor who'd seen cases collapse because law enforcement hadn't properly investigated. Jax was the only person who'd broken the law to save a child. That made him either cautionary tale or inspiration, depending on perspective. Saturday brought the decision to drive to the clubhouse. Danny had texted about a bike that needed carburetor work. Good excuse to see his brothers and avoid thinking about Senate testimony. The garage was busy when he arrived. Two prospects Jax didn't recognize working under Danny's supervision. Hammer in the corner, rebuilding a transmission. The kind of scene that had been playing out here for 3 decades. Danny pulled him aside after initial greetings. Heard you're testifying in D.C. News traveled fast in small communities. Jax shouldn't have been surprised. Seemed like the right thing to do. Danny studied him, looking for something Jax couldn't identify. Eventually nodded. Want company? I could drive up with you. Backup even if you don't need it. The offer touched something Jax had been trying to ignore. The loneliness of facing institutional judgment alone. He'd done it at trial, at sentencing, at parole hearings. Always by himself because involving others meant spreading risk. But this wasn't criminal proceedings. This was voluntary testimony. And having Danny there would mean brotherhood extending beyond the clubhouse into marble halls where men made laws. I'd appreciate that. The carburetor work took 3 hours. Meticulous cleaning and adjustment. The kind of mechanical meditation that cleared minds while occupying hands. They worked in comfortable silence, broken only by requests for tools or observations about parts that needed replacing. Afternoon brought Hammer's announcement that Emma and Tyler were coming by. The boy had asked specifically to see the motorcycle drawings again. Something about a school project on art that told stories. Tyler arrived with the same boundless energy that had characterized his previous visit. He made straight for the wall of drawings, studying them with 8-year-old intensity. Did the girl who drew these know she was making art, or was she just drawing? The question was more sophisticated than Jax expected. He joined Tyler by the wall, considering how to answer honestly without overwhelming a child with complexity. She was working through bad things that had happened. The drawing helped her process feelings she couldn't talk about yet. Art came from that need, not from trying to make art. Tyler absorbed this, pointed to one of the later drawings where Lily had attempted perspective and shading. This one's different, more careful. That one's from when she was 12. By then she'd been in therapy for 6 years, had learned to think about what she was drawing, not just react to feelings. Cool. The simple assessment felt appropriate. Art was cool. Healing was cool. The combination of both was worthy of 8-year-old approval. Emma watched from the doorway. Her expression was complicated. Pride at her son's interest. Concern about what those drawings represented. Gratitude that Jax was willing to explain difficult subjects to a child. Tyler, we need to head home. School night tomorrow. The universal protest came. 5 more minutes. Just want to look at them all. Emma held firm. Tyler capitulated with the resigned acceptance of a child who'd learned which battles could be won. Before leaving, Tyler turned back to Jax. Can I take a picture of them for my project? The request caught him off guard. Lily's drawings had never been photographed for public consumption. They were private artifacts of healing displayed in a private space. But Tyler was 8. His school project would reach an audience of teachers and maybe some parents. Not exactly public exposure. Let me check with Lily first. If she says yes, I'll text your grandpa and he can bring you by. Tyler seemed satisfied with this compromise. Emma mouthed thank you over his head. They left in the kind of controlled chaos that accompanied moving 8-year-olds from interesting places to necessary obligations. Jax pulled out his phone, texted Lily asking if she'd be comfortable with a child photographing her drawings for a school art project. Explained the context. Waited. Her response came 15 minutes later. That's actually really sweet. Tell him yes, but make sure he knows the story behind them isn't for school projects. Just the art itself. The boundary was clear and appropriate. Jax texted Hammer with permission and parameters. Got back thumbs up emoji and a promise to coordinate for Sunday afternoon. Evening brought the decision to head home. His back ached from hours bent over carburetors. Knees protested the stairs to his apartment. At 61, the body's complaints were growing harder to ignore. Inside, he microwaved dinner and ate standing at the counter. The television played news coverage of political dysfunction in Washington, the same city where he'd be testifying in 2.5 weeks. The thought generated anxiety that settled in his stomach like lead. But he'd committed. Backing out now would mean disappointing Agent Kim and potentially derailing investigation that might actually help prevent future victims. His phone buzzed. Text from Karen Roberts. Just wanted to confirm you are still coming for Thanksgiving. Lily's been talking about it all week. She's nervous about you meeting Michael, but excited too. The message was warm and inclusive, the kind of thing that happened in families where relationships function properly. Jack still wasn't entirely sure how he fit into Lily's family structure. Not father, not uncle, something without clear definition, but heavy with meaning. He confirmed attendance, asked again about bringing something. Karen responded that rolls would be perfect and included the bakery's address. Sunday afternoon, Tyler returned with Emma and Hammer. The boy had a phone borrowed from his mother for photography purposes. He approached the wall of drawings with the careful reverence children sometimes brought to things adults had taught them to respect. Jack supervised loosely, making sure Tyler understood the boundaries, that these were representations of trauma healing, that the story behind them wasn't his to share, that art could be appreciated without fully understanding context. Tyler took his photos, thanked Jax with formal politeness that made Emma smile. They left with promises to share the finished school project. The interaction was brief but felt significant. Another connection formed between Big Iron and the outside world. More evidence that the club wasn't what Millbrook's respectable citizens feared. Monday brought return to work. Carl had 3 brake jobs scheduled and a transmission that needed finishing. The routine was familiar and comforting. Physical labor that produced visible results. Lunch brought a call from Agent Kim. Details about the Senate testimony. Witnesses would testify in order of involvement. Jax would go forth after 2 parents and a CPS worker. His testimony would focus on the sequence of failures that necessitated breaking the law. She walked him through likely questions. How he tried proper channels first. Why he believed the system had failed Lily. What changes he thought could prevent similar situations. Whether he regretted breaking the law. That last question would be complicated. No and yes simultaneously. No regret for saving Lily, but yes, regret that saving her required destroying his own life. Agent Kim seemed to understand the complexity. Just be honest, the committee isn't trying to trap you. They want to understand what drove a man with no criminal history to commit federal crimes. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving brought final preparations for the trip to Washington. Jax had never been to D.C., never had reason to engage with federal government beyond Marine Corps service 30 years prior. Danny confirmed he'd drive. They'd leave Sunday morning, give themselves a day to acclimate before Wednesday testimony, return Thursday so Jax could make Thanksgiving dinner Friday. The logistics were straightforward. The emotional weight was less manageable. Wednesday evening brought a call from Lily. Just wanted to hear your voice before Thanksgiving. Make sure you're doing okay. Her concern was touching. Role reversal from the 6-year-old who'd needed him to the 23-year-old checking on his well-being. I'm fine. Little nervous about meeting Michael. Lily laughed. He's more nervous about meeting you. I may have mentioned you served time for rescuing me from a predator. He's very aware that you're capable of decisive action. The warning was probably helpful. Pre-med students didn't usually socialize with bikers who'd done federal time. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing important. Her classes, his work, weather forecasts for Thanksgiving, the comfortable drift of people who cared about each other checking in. After hanging up, Jack sat in his apartment, watching sunset through dirty windows. 3 days until he'd meet Lily's boyfriend. 4 days until he'd testify before senators. The convergence of ordinary family moments and extraordinary institutional engagement felt surreal. He went to bed early. Sleep came easier than expected. Dreams were fragmentary, but not nightmares. Progress in its own way. Thursday brought light work. Carl was closing early for the holiday. Jax finished an oil change and brake job by 2. Headed home to apartment that felt emptier, knowing he'd be in Washington most of next week. Friday morning, he drove to the bakery on Oak Street, ordered 2 dozen rolls for pickup on Thanksgiving morning. The woman behind the counter recognized him. Her smile was cautious but present, small victories in a town that remembered. The rest of the day dissolved into preparation he didn't know how to make. Senate testimony required clothes better than his usual jeans and t-shirt. He owned one suit bought for parole hearings. It still fit, though the fit emphasized how thin he'd become. Saturday brought motorcycle maintenance, oil change and chain adjustment, the kind of meditative work that cleared his head before stressful events. Sunday morning, Danny arrived at 6. They loaded minimal luggage into his truck and headed east. 17 hours to Washington, D.C. They drive in shifts, stop for food and gas, arrive late evening and crash at the hotel the FBI had arranged. The highway stretched ahead, promising distance from everything familiar. Jax watched Oklahoma fade in the side mirror, the landscape of his entire life disappearing behind them as they drove toward marble buildings where men made decisions affecting millions. Somewhere ahead was Wednesday testimony, questions without good answers, cameras recording every word. After that was Friday dinner with Lily and her family, two different worlds requiring two different versions of himself. The truck's engine hummed its steady rhythm, radio played classic rock neither of them listened to. Miles accumulated on the odometer, and Jax tried not to think about how 13 years ago he'd made one decision that had led inexorably to this moment. A 6-year-old girl walking into a garage on bare feet. 3 words that changed everything. I need help. Everything after had flowed from that moment. The rescue, the arrest, the trial, the 13 years lost, and now this. Driving toward the nation's capital to explain why sometimes doing right required breaking every rule that existed. The sun climbed higher, the highway unreeled beneath tires. Danny drove with the casual competence of someone who'd logged 1,000,000 miles. Jax watched America scroll past the window. Farmland giving way to suburbs, giving way to cities. By evening, they'd crossed into Tennessee, stopped for dinner at a truck stop where the coffee was terrible and the pie was worse, but the portions were honest. Stretched legs in the parking lot where semis idled, and travelers moved with the glazed exhaustion of people going somewhere they'd rather not. Danny took over driving as darkness fell. Jax watched the highway's centerline unreal in headlights. His thoughts drifted to what waited at journey's end. Senators and questions, Lily and family. 2 futures converging in ways he couldn't predict. Sleep came in the passenger seat somewhere in Virginia. Fitful rest interrupted by road noise and the occasional jolt of rough pavement. He woke as they pulled into the hotel parking lot near Capitol Hill. The building was generic business traveler accommodation. Clean and functional without character. They checked in, found their rooms, agreed to meet for breakfast at 7. Jax lay on a bed that wasn't his in a city he didn't know. Tomorrow was Monday. Tuesday would bring final prep with Agent Kim. Wednesday was testimony. 3 days until he'd sit before cameras and explain how a system failed so completely that only crime could correct it. 3 days to prepare words that would justify 13 years lost to making one choice that shouldn't have been necessary. He closed his eyes. Sleep was distant. The ceiling was unfamiliar. But eventually exhaustion won, and he drifted into dreams where desert sand mixed with Oklahoma clay and a small voice asked for help that never stopped echoing. Morning in Washington arrived with humidity that felt personal. Jax woke to unfamiliar sounds of traffic patterns different from Oklahoma's languid rhythms. The hotel room's generic efficiency made remembering where he was require conscious effort. Danny knocked at 6:30. They found breakfast in the lobby where business travelers ate alone, staring at phones. Nobody made eye contact. The coffee was better than truck stop quality, but carried the institutional flavor of bulk brewing. Agent Kim arrived at 8 wearing the same purposeful professionalism she'd shown in Millbrook. She carried a leather folder in the confidence of someone operating on home territory. We'll do prep in the conference room. Go over likely questions. Review your written testimony. Make sure you're comfortable with format. The conference room was windowless and beige. Fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that suggested maintenance was theoretical. Agent Kim spread documents across a table designed for corporate meetings about quarterly projections. Your testimony is scheduled for 2 p.m. Wednesday. You'll be fourth witness. Each person gets opening statement of 5 to 7 minutes. Then senators ask questions. Usually runs about 40 minutes total per witness. She walked him through the panel. 7 senators, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, 1 independent who caucused with Democrats but maintained ideological distance. Their names meant nothing to Jax. Politics had continued without his participation for 13 years. Senator Richardson chairs the committee. Former prosecutor. He'll ask about specific system failures. Senator Morris will push on whether you regret breaking the law. She's tough on crime, but also tough on institutional corruption. Senator Hayes, no relation to your Chief Hayes, will focus on policy recommendations. The briefing continued. Procedural details about swearing in and time limits, guidance on addressing senators properly, suggestions about maintaining composure if questions became hostile. Some senators may try to make you look like a vigilante who thinks he's above the law. Don't get defensive. Just explain the sequence of failures that led to your decision. Jax had spent years explaining that sequence, to prosecutors trying to convict him, to judges trying to sentence him, to parole boards trying to determine if he'd reoffend. The story didn't change. Only the audience rotated. They spent 3 hours on preparation, mock questions, and suggested responses. By 11, Jax felt saturated with information. Agent Kim seemed satisfied. You'll do fine. Just remember you're not on trial. You're helping us understand what went wrong so we can fix it. The distinction felt thin. Every time he told this story, he was on trial, judged by people who'd never faced that particular choice, never watched a 6-year-old try to explain pain she didn't have words for. Lunch was sandwiches that tasted like their plastic packaging. Jax ate without appetite. Danny made conversation about the city, tourist observations about monuments visible from their hotel, filler words to occupy space where anxiety lived. The afternoon brought free time before dinner with Agent Kim's team. Jax and Danny walked. No destination, just movement through streets where history had happened and was happening. The Capitol building rose white against blue sky. Tourists clustered, taking photos. School groups followed teachers who competed with traffic noise to share civics lessons. Democracy's machinery grinding forward regardless of individual crises. They found themselves at the Vietnam Memorial. Hammer had mentioned it once, said he couldn't bring himself to visit. Too many names he recognized. Danny stood respectful distance while Jax walked the length looking for Marines he'd known who'd served 40 years before him. The names were organized chronologically. Year by year, the war had consumed men. Some years worse than others. 1968 particularly brutal. Jax found himself counting casualties by state. Oklahoma's contribution measured in etched letters. You good? Danny's question came from behind. Jax hadn't heard him approach, thinking about how many of these guys died because systems failed them too. Bad intelligence. Politicians who wouldn't let them win. Home front that blamed them for policy they didn't make. Similar pattern. People in power making decisions. People without power paying costs. They left the memorial, found a bar that catered to after-work crowd from government offices, ordered beer, and sat in a booth watching young staffers discuss legislation with the earnest intensity of people who still believed incremental change mattered. The television above the bar played news coverage with sound muted. Images of senators speaking, the president signing something. Foreign conflicts in countries Jax couldn't locate on a map. The machinery of global power on display for consumption. Danny finished his beer, ordered another, waited until the bartender was out of earshot before speaking. You don't have to do this. We could leave tonight. Tell them you changed your mind. Nothing they can do to force you. The observation was accurate. Testimony was voluntary. He could walk away, drive back to Oklahoma, and resume his life of oil changes and rent checks that barely cleared. But Lily had asked him to speak to her class. Agent Kim had asked him to speak to senators. Both requests pointed toward the same goal, making systems less likely to fail the next child. I'm doing it. Danny nodded. Didn't push. That was brotherhood. Offering exit while respecting choice to continue. Dinner was Thai food with Agent Kim and 2 other FBI agents working the web investigation. They discussed logistics for Wednesday, where Jack should arrive, who would meet him, standard protocol for witnesses requiring security. The meal was professionally cordial, shop talk about other cases, careful avoidance of personal topics that might create discomfort. By 9, Jax felt exhausted by forced sociability. Back at the hotel, he lay on the unfamiliar bed, staring at unfamiliar ceiling. Tomorrow was Tuesday, one day between now and testimony. Not enough time to prepare emotionally, too much time to dread inevitably. His phone showed messages from Lily. Just thinking about you, know you're in D.C. for the testimony Wednesday. You'll do great. Also, Michael wants me to ask what he should call you. Mr. Reeves seems too formal, but not sure what else is appropriate. The question made him smile despite tension. 23-year-old asking permission for her boyfriend to use his first name. Social navigation through relationship categories that had no clear definitions. He texted back, "Jax is fine. Mr. Reeves makes me feel old." Her response was immediate. "You earned the right to be old. See you Friday. Love you." Those last two words sat on the screen carrying weight they'd always carried. Lily had said them first during a supervised visit when she was 9. 3 years into foster care. 3 years into therapy. Old enough to understand what love meant and brave enough to risk offering it. Jax had cried then. Couldn't help it. Had excused himself and stood in the hallway composing himself while a social worker watched through a window to ensure he wasn't fleeing. He'd said it back eventually, after confirming with Karen Roberts that it was appropriate, that expressing affection wouldn't complicate custody or suggest improper attachment. All the institutional paranoia that surrounded men caring about children in modern America. Sleep arrived late and departed early. Morning brought Tuesday's preparation marathon. More mock questioning, more strategy about maintaining composure. Agent Kim was thorough to the point of exhaustion. Lunch was working meal with sandwiches while reviewing other witnesses' testimony. The parents of victims would speak about discovering abuse, about reporting to authorities, about having concerns dismissed because perpetrators wore badges. One mother had recorded her interactions with police. The audio was damning. Officers suggesting her daughter was confused, implying the mother was vindictive following a custody dispute, building narrative that protected a deputy at child's expense. Agent Kim played 30 seconds before Jax asked her to stop. He didn't need to hear more. He'd lived this reality, knew how systems protected authority over innocence. The afternoon brought free time. Danny suggested the Air and Space Museum, something to occupy minds before tomorrow's performance. They spent 2 hours looking at aircraft and spacecraft, engineering marvels that had carried humans beyond atmosphere. Jax found himself drawn to exhibits about Apollo program. Men risking everything to reach impossible destination. Similar calculation to his own, massive risk for uncertain benefit. But someone had to try, or nothing would ever change. Evening brought early dinner and retreat to hotel rooms. Agent Kim texted final logistics. Be at Senate building by noon. Someone would meet him at security. Bring ID, dress professionally, but not like you're pretending to be something you're not. The last instruction was interesting. Permission to present authentically. Jax owned one suit, but bringing it had felt like costume. He settled on clean jeans and a button-down shirt. Respectful but honest about who he was. Danny knocked around 8, brought beer from a convenience store. They sat in Jax's room watching television, neither paid attention to. Companionable silence between brothers who'd learned communication didn't require constant words. You scared? The question was direct. Danny's style. No dancing around discomfort. Terrified. Good. Means you're taking it seriously. They finished the beer. Danny left around 10. Jax tried sleeping, managed a few hours between periods of staring at ceiling, trying not to think about tomorrow. Morning arrived with weight. Wednesday. Testimony day. Jax showered and dressed with mechanical precision. Each action performed to standard without thought. Danny drove them to Capitol Hill. Traffic was worse than previous days. Tourists mixed with staff, mixed with protesters, holding signs about issues Jax didn't recognize. Democracy's daily chaos on full display. Security at the Senate building was thorough. Metal detectors and bag searches. ID verification. Agent Kim had arranged visitor passes that expedited the process slightly. They were directed to a waiting room on the 3rd floor. The other witnesses were already present. 2 mothers who'd lost children to predators, protected by institutional failure. One sat quietly clutching tissues. The other paced with barely contained fury. A CPS worker who'd been fired for pushing investigations her supervisors wanted buried. Agent Kim made introductions, names Jax would forget immediately, faces etched with the particular damage that came from having systems fail people you'd tried to protect. One mother approached after formalities concluded, mid-40s with eyes that had seen too much. She held out her hand. Sarah Martinez, my daughter Sophia was Ethan Cross's victim in Riverside. Thank you for stopping him. Even if it came years too late for us. Her gratitude felt unearned. He'd saved Lily, but Sophia and 45 others had suffered before that. The mathematics of partial victory offered no comfort. "I'm sorry I didn't know sooner." Sarah's smile was sad. "How could you have known? The system protected him. Gave him fresh start in your town. By the time you encountered him, he'd already destroyed my daughter's childhood." They sat in uncomfortable chairs, drinking bad coffee from a machine that had been refilled too infrequently. The conversation drifted to logistics. Who testified when, how long each person had, what questions to expect. At 1:30, a staffer arrived, young woman with clipboard in the harried efficiency of someone managing too many tasks simultaneously. She led them through marble hallways where portraits of historic senators watched from walls. The hearing room was smaller than Jax expected. Rows of seats for spectators. A raised dais where senators would sit. Table with microphones for witnesses, camera crews setting up in designated areas. The machinery of televised democracy preparing for another performance. Senator Richardson entered first. Mid-60s with silver hair and posture suggesting military background. He nodded to witnesses without speaking. Other senators filtered in over the next 10 minutes. Staffers scurried distributing documents and whispering updates. At precisely 2, the gavel fell. Senator Richardson's voice carried authority earned through decades of public speaking. "This hearing of the Subcommittee on Criminal Justice Reform will come to order. We're here to examine institutional failures that enable predators in law enforcement to victimize children while colleagues and supervisors look the other way." The opening statement continued, outlining scope of investigation, naming Marcus Webb and the 9 deputies he'd protected, citing 47 verified victims, promising accountability and systemic reform. Jax listened with half attention. The numbers were familiar. The rhetoric about justice and protection sounded genuine, but years of experience had taught him words were cheap. Action cost. Results required sustained pressure. The first witness was Sarah Martinez. She approached the microphone with visible tension. Her voice shook initially, then steadied as anger provided ballast. "My daughter Sophia reported Deputy Cameron Russo to school counselors when she was 11. The counselors called police. Police sent Russo to interview her. He convinced her she'd misunderstood normal affection. He was her abuser and we sent him to investigate himself." Her testimony was devastating. She detailed multiple reports, multiple dismissals. Russo's transfer to Oklahoma where he became Ethan Cross and found new victims. The system's absolute failure to protect children from one of its own. Questions from senators were respectful but probing. How many times had she reported? To whom? What responses did she receive? Did anyone ever suggest she was lying or mistaken? Sarah answered each question with specifics, dates and names and quotes from officials who'd chosen institutional loyalty over child safety. By the time she finished, 2 senators were visibly emotional. The second witness was the CPS worker, Margaret Chen, 48, with the exhausted competence of someone who'd fought bureaucracy too long. Her testimony focused on internal pressure to close cases involving law enforcement. "I was told repeatedly that investigating cops required higher standards of evidence, that we couldn't move forward on a child's word alone when the accused wore a badge. Every case I tried to pursue was blocked at supervisor level." Senator Morris leaned forward. "What happened when you persisted? I was reassigned to intake desk work, then written up for procedural violations that were standard practice, eventually fired for insubordination. They made it clear the price of pushing these cases was my career." The third witness was another mother, Amy Foster, whose son Noah had been victimized by a deputy in Texas. Her testimony echoed Sarah's. Reports made. Reports dismissed. Transfer approved. Fresh start granted to predator. Then it was Jax's turn. He stood and moved to the witness table. The microphone was closer than expected. Cameras tracked his movement. Senators watched with expressions ranging from sympathy to skepticism. Agent Kim had prepared him for this moment. Opening statement, establishing credibility. Then the sequence of events. Finally, his analysis of system failures. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Marine training providing discipline when emotion threatened control. "My name is Jackson Reeves. I served 8 years in federal prison for kidnapping. I was guilty of that crime. I took a 6-year-old girl from her legal guardian without permission. I violated a restraining order. I broke multiple laws. He paused. Let that reality settle. I did all that because every legal option had failed Lily Morrison. I reported to Child Protective Services and was told they'd assess in 72 hours. I took her to the hospital where a doctor documented evidence of sexual abuse. The police chief dismissed it. I was given a restraining order that prevented me from protecting her while the man abusing her maintained full access. The room was silent. Even cameras seemed to pause their mechanical sounds. One night, Lily called 911. The call was recorded. She begged for help, said Deputy Ethan Cross was hurting her. The dispatcher knew both of them. She marked it as a nightmare and sent no one. I listened to that call, heard a 6-year-old being ignored by the last safety net that should have caught her. Senator Richardson interrupted. What did you do then? I broke into her home at 3 in the morning, found her locked in a bathroom from the outside. She was bleeding. Ethan Cross was passed out drunk in the living room. I took her and drove to the FBI, turned myself in, because saving her life was worth losing my freedom. The silence extended. Jax could feel judgment being calculated by 7 people with power to shape legislation. Could feel cameras transmitting this moment to audiences who'd reduce it to political talking points. Senator Morris spoke next. Her voice was sharp but not hostile. Do you regret breaking the law? The question Agent Kim had prepared him for. The one without good answer. I regret that breaking the law was necessary. I regret that a child had to suffer while systems failed. I regret that the only way to save her was to destroy my own life. But I don't regret saving her. She's alive. She's thriving. She's in college studying social work so she can help other kids the system fails. That's worth everything it cost. Would you do it again under similar circumstances? Jax met her eyes, saw calculation there. This was the trap. Admit he'd break the law again and prove he was unrepentant vigilante. Claim he wouldn't and lie on camera. If I encountered the same situation tomorrow, every legal option exhausted, a child dying by inches while systems protected her abuser. Yes, ma'am, I'd do it again. Because some costs are worth paying. Senator Morris nodded slowly, didn't follow up, had received the answer she needed to make whatever point she'd planned. The questions continued. Senator Hayes asked about policy recommendations. What changes might prevent similar failures? Jax outlined ideas Agent Kim had helped develop. Independent review of closed cases involving law enforcement. Civilian oversight of abuse investigations. Mandatory recording of all CPS contacts. Senator Richardson asked about his background. Military service. Previous arrests. What had prepared him to make the decision he'd made? Jax answered honestly. Said the Marines had taught him about calculated risk. Prison had taught him about institutional failure. Cage had taught him some things mattered more than personal comfort. 40 minutes passed in compressed time. Questions became repetitive. Senators exhausted their prepared inquiries. Richardson thanked him for his testimony, said his perspective was valuable despite complicated circumstances. Jax returned to the waiting area. Hands were shaking now that adrenaline was fading. Danny appeared with water, didn't speak, just presence offering stability. The final witness was a prosecutor from New Mexico who'd seen multiple cases collapse when local police refused to properly investigate allegations against colleagues. Her testimony was technical, focused on prosecutorial challenges when law enforcement was both investigator and subject. By 4, the hearing concluded. Senator Richardson promised the committee would review testimony and draft reform legislation, promised accountability for institutional failures, promised change. Jax had heard promises before, from parole boards, from politicians during campaigns. Words were easy. Implementation was where promises died. Outside the building, Danny suggested food. Jax had no appetite, but recognized the need for normalcy. They found a diner near the hotel. Ordered burgers that arrived too large and fries that were adequate. How do you feel? Hollow, like I just performed someone else's trauma for entertainment. Danny didn't contradict. Sometimes acknowledgement was better than reassurance. They ate in silence, watching other diners go about ordinary evenings, couples on dates, families with young children navigating menu choices. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that nearby a man was processing, having just explained to senators why he'd committed federal crimes. Jax's phone buzzed. Text from Lily. Watch the live stream. You were amazing. So proud of you. See you tomorrow for Thanksgiving. The message helped, reminder that this had purpose beyond political theater. That speaking truth about system failures might actually help prevent future Lilies from walking into garages on bare feet. Back at the hotel, exhaustion hit completely. Jax showered and collapsed on the bed. Sleep came immediately. Dreamless and deep. Body shut down from emotional overload. Morning brought Thursday, Thanksgiving. They drive back to Oklahoma today. Arrive late evening. Tomorrow was dinner with Lily's family. The return drive was quieter than outbound journey. Jax spent hours watching the landscape reverse. Virginia giving way to Tennessee, giving way to Arkansas. America scrolling past at highway speed. Danny drove most of it, seemed to understand Jax needed time in his own head, processing testimony and questions in the strange performance of explaining trauma for institutional consumption. They stopped for Boss in Arkansas. Truck stop with the same terrible coffee and worse pie. Jax called Agent Kim to confirm he'd fulfilled his obligation. She thanked him, said his testimony had been exactly what they needed, said media coverage was positive, said this could actually move legislation forward. He thanked her and hung up. Believed maybe 30% of what she'd said. Hoped that 30% was enough. Evening found them crossing into Oklahoma. Familiar landscape after days of displacement. Danny dropped Jax at his apartment complex around 9. Promised to check in over the weekend. Inside was unchanged. Lily's drawings on walls, minimal furniture, the basic infrastructure of existence without excess. Jax set his phone to charge. Checked messages. One from Karen Roberts confirming tomorrow's dinner at 2. One from Margaret Sullivan congratulating him on testimony she'd watched on C-SPAN. One from Hammer saying Emma and Tyler had watched too. Tyler had questions about the drawings. He responded to each briefly, then sat on the thrift store couch in his quiet apartment and let the past 4 days settle into memory. He testified before senators, explained his crimes to the nation, given Lily's story to strangers who'd use it for purposes beyond his control. The cost of that exposure was yet to be determined, but tomorrow he'd have Thanksgiving dinner with her family, meet her boyfriend, pretend for a few hours that their relationship was something close to normal. That would be enough. Morning brought Friday, Thanksgiving. Jax showered and dressed in clothes marginally nicer than as usual. Stopped at the bakery on Oak Street and collected 24 rolls that smelled like childhood nostalgia. The drive to Karen and David Roberts' house took 20 minutes through streets decorated for holidays. Inflatable turkeys and pilgrim displays. The commercial machinery of American tradition on full display. Their home was suburban standard. 2 stories with attached garage. Lawn maintained to neighborhood standards. The kind of place that represented stability and middle-class achievement. Jax parked on the street, gathered the rolls, walked to the front door with butterflies in his stomach that felt absurd for a 61-year-old man who'd survived combat in prison. Karen answered before he knocked. Mid-50s with the warm efficiency of someone who'd spent decades managing family chaos. She took the rolls with genuine gratitude. Lily's in the kitchen. Michael's helping her with sweet potatoes. Fair warning, he's terrified of you. The observation was delivered with humor, but carried truth. Jax had considered how intimidating he must seem. Biker with prison record who'd kidnapped his girlfriend when she was 6. Not exactly Hallmark movie material. Inside smelled like holiday traditions, turkey and stuffing, and pies cooling on counters. The Roberts had 2 other children, foster placements that became permanent, a boy of 12 and girl of 9. They regarded Jax with shy curiosity. Lily emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron and carrying wooden spoon. At 23, she'd grown into someone Jax barely recognized, confident, healthy, no trace of the damaged child who'd appeared in his garage 17 years ago. She hugged him without hesitation. Strong and genuine. Released him and pulled forward a young man who'd been hovering protectively nearby. Jax, this is Michael. Michael, this is Jax, the man I've told you about. Michael was mid-20s with the earnest intensity of pre-med students everywhere. He extended his hand, Grip firm but not aggressive, meeting eyes despite obvious discomfort. Nice to meet you, sir. Lily's told me everything about what you did, what it cost. I just want you to know I think what you did was incredibly brave. The formality was endearing. Jack shook his hand, tried to project non-threatening energy despite leather vest and visible tattoos. Good to meet you, Michael, and it's just Jax. Sir makes me feel old. Dinner was chaos in the best way. Karen orchestrating timing of multiple dishes, David manning the turkey carving. Children arguing about who got which chair. Lily and Michael working together with the easy synchronization of couples who'd learned each other's rhythms. They gathered around a table that barely fit everyone. David said grace that was mercifully brief. Then food was passed and plates were filled, and conversation flowed around Jax, who felt simultaneously present and displaced. Michael asked careful questions about motorcycles. Safe topic that avoided heavier subjects. Jax answered easily, discussing maintenance and restoration, the mechanical meditation that had sustained him through decades. The 12-year-old boy asked about prison, blunt curiosity without social filters. Karen started to redirect, but Jax interrupted. It's okay. Prison is exactly as bad as you imagine, boring and dangerous simultaneously. But it was consequence of choice I'd make again. Why would you choose to go to prison? The question was innocent, deserved honest answer. Because your sister Lily needed help and nobody else was helping her. Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything, but that doesn't make it less right. The boy absorbed this seriously, nodded like it made sense, returned to his mashed potatoes with the easy acceptance children brought to moral complexity adults struggled with. After dinner, Lily pulled Jax aside. They stood in the backyard where fall had killed the grass and left brown patches. Thank you for testifying. I know it was hard. Worth it if it changes anything. It already changed something. Me. Watching you explain what happened. Why you did what you did. I've spent years processing my trauma, but hearing you talk about your trauma, what saving me cost you, that helped me understand differently. She paused, studied him with eyes that had regained their appropriate age. I'm going to spend my career fixing the system that failed me. Failed you. Failed all 47 of us. That's my purpose. My way of making your 13 years mean something. They always meant something. You're alive. That's all the meaning necessary. They returned to the house where pie was being served and football played on television nobody watched. The afternoon dissolved into full-stomach contentment. Michael relaxed incrementally. The children grew louder until Karen enforced quiet time. Jax left around 6. Thanked his hosts, hugged Lily goodbye, shook Michael's hand and told him quietly to take care of her. Michael promised he would with the solemnity of someone understanding assignment. The drive home felt longer than it was. Jax was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Emotional fatigue from performing normalcy, from pretending his relationship with Lily's family was something standard enough to not require constant explanation. His apartment was dark and cold. He turned on lights and heat, made coffee he didn't drink, sat on the couch staring at drawings on the wall. His phone buzzed. Text from Danny asking how it went. Jax responded that it was good. Boyfriend seemed decent. Family was kind. All true, but incomplete. Another text from Agent Kim. Media coverage of testimony was extensive. Several senators had issued statements supporting reform legislation. Things were moving forward. Jack set the phone aside, closed his eyes, let the week wash over him. Washington testimony. Thanksgiving dinner. 2 different performances of 2 different versions of himself. He didn't know which felt more authentic anymore. The biker who'd broken laws to save a child, or the dinner guest making small talk about motorcycles while pretending 13 years of his life hadn't been consumed by one June afternoon's decision. Maybe both were true. Maybe authentic selfhood was contradiction contained in the same body. Marine and convict, hero and criminal. The man who'd lost everything and the man who had saved one life. His phone buzzed again, this time from Lily. Just wanted to say again how much today meant. Having you there, watching you interact with Michael and my siblings. Your family, Jax, always have been, always will be. Family. The words sat on his screen carrying implications he'd spent years trying to understand. He'd never had traditional family, never married, never had children, but somehow a 6-year-old's desperate plea had created bonds stronger than biology. He texted back, "You're my family too. Everything I did was worth it." He meant it. Every word. 13 years of his life for her chance at this moment. College and boyfriend and career plans, normal life emerging from ashes of destroyed childhood. The mathematics justified themselves. Outside his window, Millbrook's nighttime lights fought against darkness. Somewhere in this town were people who still considered him criminal. Others who saw him as hero. Most just wanted him to be invisible so they could forget complicated history. Tomorrow was Saturday. He'd work at the garage, change oil and replace brake pads. The familiar rhythm of mechanical labor that asked nothing beyond competence. But tonight he sat in his apartment surrounded by evidence of one child's healing and understood that somehow, against all probability, he'd done something that mattered. The cost had been everything. The return was one life saved and maybe a few laws changed and possibly some future children protected, because he'd testified to senators who might actually care. In the economy of meaning, that had to be enough. Winter came to Oklahoma with the slow inevitability of age. Jax woke on the first Saturday of December to frost on windows and joints that protested movement. 61 felt older in cold weather. The body kept ledgers of accumulated damage and presented bills with compound interest. Carl's garage was marginally warmer than outside. The space heaters fought losing battles against drafts that found gaps in metal siding. Jax worked on a transmission rebuild wearing fingerless gloves that allowed precision while preventing frostbite. The television mounted in the corner played morning news. Sound low enough to ignore until Agent Kim's face appeared on screen. Senate hearing footage. Jax's own voice explaining why he'd broken laws to save a child. Carl noticed him watching, turned up the volume without asking. The reporter's voice carried practiced neutrality. Following testimony from multiple witnesses, the Senate Subcommittee on Criminal Justice Reform has advanced the Institutional Accountability for Child Protection Act. If passed, the legislation would require independent review of closed abuse cases involving law enforcement personnel. Senator Richardson appeared in an interview clip. We heard compelling testimony from victims' families and from Jackson Reeves, whose decision to rescue a child cost him 8 years in federal prison. Their courage demands our response. The segment ended, returned to stories about economic indicators and foreign policy. Carl muted the television. Looks like your testimony actually did something. Maybe. Politicians promise a lot. Delivery is different. True enough, they worked in comfortable silence. The transmission required methodical attention. Each gear and synchronizer positioned precisely. Mechanical order emerging from disassembled chaos. Lunch brought a call from Lily. Her voice carried excitement that reminded Jax she was still young enough for optimism. Did you see the news? They're actually moving legislation forward. Senator Richardson's office called. They want me to testify when it comes to floor vote, as a survivor who benefited from your intervention. The request made tactical sense. Lily was articulate and sympathetic. Her success after trauma provided compelling narrative for policy change, but it also meant exposing her again to public scrutiny. What do you think about that? I think it's important. If my story helps change systems that failed me, that's worth the discomfort. Besides, you testified, I can too. Her logic was sound even if Jax wished she didn't have to make that calculation. Some burdens couldn't be carried by others, no matter how much you wanted to spare them. They talked for 20 minutes about logistics, her final schedule, holiday plans, Michael's family inviting her to Christmas. The ordinary complexity of a 23-year-old's life. After hanging up, Jax returned to work with something approaching contentment. The transmission was coming together. Lily was thriving. Legislation might actually pass. Small victories in the accumulation that constituted progress. Evening found him at Big Iron Clubhouse. Danny had called about a carburetor that needed rebuilding. Hammer was there working on his bike's electrical system. Just the three of them in the garage where everything had started 17 years ago. Heard you're famous now. Senate testimony all over the news. Hammer's tone carried gentle mockery. Jax accepted it in the spirit offered. 15 minutes of fame, already fading. Emma called, said Tyler's teacher showed the testimony in civics class as example of civil disobedience. Kid's been asking questions about when it's okay to break rules. The idea of his actions being taught to children as civics lesson felt surreal. Jax had never considered himself civically engaged, had avoided politics beyond voting occasionally, but apparently rescuing a child qualified as political statement. What did Emma tell him? That some rules protect people and some rules protect power. Learning the difference is what makes you an adult. Wise answer. They worked until darkness made continuing impractical. The clubhouse had lights, but they were inadequate for detail work. Danny suggested beer and food. They drove to the diner that had served Millbrook for 50 years. The waitress who'd served Jack since his 20s approached with coffee pot. Her smile was marginally warmer than previous months. Small victories measured in incremental thawing. Saw you on television, talking to senators. Yes, ma'am, took courage, admitting you broke the law, explaining why. She poured coffee without waiting for response, moved to the next table. Jax and Danny exchanged glances. Something had shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that complexity existed beyond simple judgment. They ordered burgers, ate while discussing club business. Membership was down to 3. Prospects had dried up. Younger generations didn't join motorcycle clubs with the same commitment previous eras had shown. Might be we're the last of Big Iron. When we're gone, the clubhouse becomes just another empty building. Danny's observation carried resignation without bitterness. Everything ended eventually. Organizations aged and died like people. Could be worse legacies than being the club that protected a kid when nobody else would. True enough, the conversation drifted to practical matters. Rising rent on the clubhouse, utility costs during winter, whether they could sustain operations with only 3 members contributing. Numbers were unforgiving. They had maybe 2 years before finances forced closing. Selling the building would barely cover debts. Big Iron would dissolve into memory and whatever lessons it had taught. Jax felt the approaching end like weather changing, inevitable and indifferent to preference. He'd spent 30 years in this club, found brotherhood and purpose, but time consumed everything regardless of sentiment. December progressed with the slow grinding of winter days, work at Carl's garage, occasional evenings at Big Iron, solitary nights in an apartment that never quite felt like home. 2 weeks before Christmas brought a letter from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Jax opened it expecting some administrative matter related to his completed sentence. Found instead notification that Ethan Cross had died. Inmate Cameron Ethan Russo, federal registration number 47839-088. Expired December 8th due to injuries sustained during altercation with other inmates. Death has been classified as homicide. Investigation is ongoing. The letter continued with bureaucratic details. Personal effects disposition, death certificate, availability. Information presented with the same neutral efficiency as parole paperwork. Jax set the letter aside. Felt nothing. Ethan's death changed nothing material. He'd already been serving 7 consecutive life sentences. Would have died in prison regardless. This just accelerated inevitable conclusion. He called Agent Kim to confirm she'd been notified. She had. Said it would complicate ongoing investigations into the network, but wouldn't derail them. Said justice had been served even if not through official channels. How do you feel about it? The question assumed he'd have feelings. Jax searched for emotional response. Found only hollow acknowledgement of fact. Indifferent. He was already gone in every way that mattered. Death just made it official. That's healthy, actually, not investing energy in a dead predator. Focusing on what comes next. What came next was Christmas. Lily invited him to join her and Michael's families for dinner. Karen and David Roberts would be there. Michael's parents driving in from Tulsa. Multi-generational gathering that would require navigating social complexities Jax had never mastered. He declined politely, said he had plans with the club. Lily accepted without pushing, but her disappointment was evident even through text message. Danny organized Christmas Eve at the clubhouse, just the 3 of them. Pizza and beer and the television playing movies nobody watched. Brotherhood without ceremony. Exactly what Jax needed. Hammer brought photos of Tyler opening presents that morning. The boy had asked for books about motorcycles and art, specific intersection of interests that spoke to conversations about Lily's drawings. Emma says he wants to be an artist who helps people. Whatever that means to an 8-year-old, means you raised her right, she raised him right. Cycles can change direction. They drank to that. Small celebration of hard-won progress. Hammer's relationship with his daughter rebuilt through years of consistent effort. Tyler growing up knowing his grandfather as flawed man, trying to be better. New Year arrived with the arbitrary significance humans assign to calendar transitions. Jack spent it alone in his apartment. No resolutions, no reflection on the year past or coming. Just another night becoming another morning. January brought cold that settled into bones. Work at the garage slowed as people deferred maintenance until spring. Carl cut Jax's hours to 30 per week, still enough to cover rent and food, barely. The legislation that had emerged from Senate testimony moved to committee votes. C-SPAN carried coverage. Jax watched on his phone during lunch breaks. Senators debated implementation details, funding mechanisms, enforcement protocols. The Institutional Accountability for Child Protection Act passed committee by 7-3 vote, would proceed to full Senate consideration in February. Senator Richardson's office contacted Lily about testifying during floor debate. She called Jax for advice, nervous about speaking but feeling obligated. He talked her through what to expect based on his experience, prepared her for hostile questions from senators who'd frame her rescue as encouraging vigilantism. Just tell the truth. What happened? How the system failed? How you're using your experience to help others? That's all they need to hear. What if I cry? Or freeze? Or say something wrong? Then you're human. Nobody expects perfection. They expect authenticity. The conversation steadied her, reminded Jax why he testified despite discomfort. Making this easier for her justified his own exposure. February brought Lily to Washington. Danny offered to drive Jax up for moral support. They made the trip in one long push, arrived the night before her testimony, exhausted but present. Lily met them for dinner near her hotel. Michael had come with her, providing support the way Danny supported Jax. Partnerships formed around witnessing difficulty. Over pasta that was overpriced and underwhelming, Lily reviewed her prepared testimony. Jax and Danny offered suggestions, mostly reassurance that her instincts were sound. Michael watched the interaction with interest. At some point during the meal, he leaned toward Jax and spoke quietly. "Thank you for what you did, not just saving her, but continuing to be present. She needs people who understand what she survived." The gratitude was genuine. Jax accepted it with the discomfort he always felt receiving credit for doing what had seemed obvious and necessary. Morning brought the Senate chamber. Larger than the committee room. More cameras, greater sense of historical weight and architecture designed to intimidate. Lily testified mid-morning. Her voice was steady. She described the abuse without graphic detail. Explained reporting to adults who didn't believe her. The isolation of being failed by every system designed to protect children. Then she described walking to Big Iron Clubhouse, finding men everyone said were dangerous, discovering they were the only ones willing to help. Jackson Reeves could have sent me away. He could have called authorities and waited for them to fail me again. Instead, he tried every legal option first. And when all of those failed, he made a choice that cost him 13 years of his life to save mine. Her voice strengthened as she continued. "I'm 23 now, college senior studying social work. I have a boyfriend I love, a family that chose me for him, friends and future, and all the things that seemed impossible when I was 6 years old and being raped by a deputy sheriff everyone trusted." The bluntness of that word, raped, silenced the chamber. Lily didn't flinch. "I'm alive and whole because one man decided a child's life was worth more than his freedom. That's the system failure we're here to address, that it required a crime to achieve justice." Questions followed. Senator Morris asked if she thought Jax's actions should be legal. Lily's response was measured. "I think the question is backwards. The question should be, why was breaking the law necessary? Why had every legal channel failed so completely that kidnapping was the only path to protection?" Senator Hayes asked about her plans after graduation. Lily explained her intention to work for Child Protective Services, to reform from inside the system that had failed her. The irony isn't lost on me. The agency that couldn't protect me will employ me to protect others. But that's how change happens. People who understand failure intimately, working to prevent its repetition. Her testimony lasted 45 minutes. When it concluded, senators thanked her for her courage, some with visible emotion. Jax watched from the gallery, pride mixing with sorrow. She shouldn't have to be this strong, shouldn't have to testify before senators about childhood trauma, but she was handling it with grace he couldn't have managed at her age. After the session concluded, they met outside the chamber. Lily was shaking from adrenaline crash. Michael held her while she processed the exposure. You did perfect. Jax's assessment was simple and true. She'd been everything the legislation needed. Sympathetic survivor, articulate advocate, living proof that recovery was possible with support. When's the vote? Senator Richardson says next week. They have the numbers. It should pass. Should wasn't guarantee, but it was better than nothing. They had dinner that evening, celebratory though the celebration felt premature. Legislation passing was one thing. Implementation and enforcement were different challenges. The drive back to Oklahoma took Jax and Danny through winter landscapes stripped bare, trees skeletal against gray sky, fields dormant waiting for spring. The visual metaphor for waiting was obvious enough to not require acknowledgement. The vote came the following Thursday. C-SPAN carried it live. The Institutional Accountability for Child Protection Act passed 63 to 37. Near party line vote with enough crossover to suggest genuine bipartisan support. Senator Richardson gave floor speech crediting survivors who testified, named Lily specifically, called Jax's testimony crucial for understanding systemic breakdown. President signed it into law 3 days later. Rose Garden ceremony with victims' families present. Lily attended. Photos showed her standing behind the president as he signed. Symbolic placement acknowledging her role in bringing the issue forward. Jax watched coverage on his phone during lunch break. Felt strange disconnect. This law existed because he'd broken other laws. His crime had generated legislative response. The mathematics of cause and effect didn't follow predictable patterns. Spring arrived with the tentative optimism characteristic of March in Oklahoma. Unpredictable weather cycling between winter and summer without settling. Work at the garage increased as people addressed maintenance deferred through cold months. Carl called Jax into his office on a Tuesday morning. The conversation he'd been anticipating for months. Business is down, been down for years. Can't sustain current overhead with decreased revenue. Gonna have to let you go end of month. I'm sorry. The apology was genuine. Carl had given him a chance when other employers wouldn't, had paid fairly and treated him with respect. But economics were unforgiving and charity had limits. I understand. Appreciate you keeping me on this long. The remaining weeks passed quickly. Jax trained his replacement, a younger guy with no record and better long-term prospects. Handed over tools and knowledge accumulated through decades of mechanical work. His last day was a Friday. Carl paid him through the weekend plus 2 weeks severance. Shook his hand. Wished him luck finding something else. At 61 with a felony record, finding something else felt optimistic. Jax applied to every garage within 30 miles. Received polite rejections, citing budget constraints or position filled. The unspoken reality was simple. Younger mechanics without criminal histories were better investments. April brought unemployment that felt different from previous periods without work. This wasn't temporary gap between jobs. This was the beginning of permanent displacement. The economy had no use for aging bikers with federal kidnapping convictions. He applied for Social Security disability. Back problems and arthritis in hands documented through years of hard labor. The application process was bureaucratic nightmare. Forms requesting information he didn't have. Medical records from providers he couldn't remember. The first denial arrived 6 weeks later. Insufficient documentation of disability. He could appeal. Would likely be denied again. Might eventually succeed after multiple appeals and years of fighting bureaucracy. Meanwhile, rent was due monthly. Food cost money. Utilities required payment regardless of employment status. He sold his truck, kept the motorcycle because it was paid off and more economical. The truck sale covered 2 months' rent. After that, the mathematics became increasingly desperate. Danny offered help. Jax refused. Big Iron was barely sustaining itself. Taking charity from brothers who were struggling felt wrong. May brought eviction notice. 60 days to vacate for non-payment of rent. The landlord was apologetic but firm. Business was business. Compassion didn't pay mortgages. Jax packed his minimal possessions. Most important were Lily's drawings. He rolled them carefully and secured them in a cardboard tube. Everything else was replaceable or unnecessary. Danny offered the clubhouse as temporary housing. Jax accepted because alternatives were shelter system or street. Neither appealed to a 61-year-old with deteriorating health. The clubhouse had bathroom and small kitchen. No bedroom, but the office had a couch that converted to bed. He moved in on the 1st of June. 17 years almost to the day since Lily had walked through the door, changing everything. Living at the clubhouse meant being present for club activities, which were minimal. Danny working days, Hammer stopping by evenings, occasional prospect appearing, then disappearing when commitment became clear. Jax occupied his days with maintenance. The building was dying slowly. Roof leaked in multiple places. Electrical system was failing incrementally. Plumbing made concerning sounds. He fixed what he could with limited resources and declining physical capability. Lily visited in late June. She'd graduated college. Social work degree with honors. Job offer from Oklahoma Department of Human Services starting in August. She'd be working in the system that had failed her, trying to fix it from inside. She found him replacing a section of corroded pipe in the bathroom, hands covered in rust and old grease, looking every bit his 61 years plus the accumulated damage. Jax. Her voice carried concern. He'd avoided telling her about the eviction and unemployment, hadn't wanted to burden her with his problems. Hey kid, congratulations on graduating. She helped him finish the repair. They sat in the garage drinking beer while he explained the past 3 months. Lost job, failed disability claim, eviction, current situation living in a dying clubhouse. Why didn't you tell me? I could have helped. Nothing to help with. Just age and economics doing what they do. Lily was quiet for a long moment, studying him with the intensity she'd brought to difficult problems since childhood. Move in with me and Michael. We're getting an apartment in Oklahoma City near my job. 3 bedrooms. You'd have your own space. Rent's covered. Just until you get disability approved and find something stable. The offer was generous and impossible. Living with his goddaughter, he'd started thinking of her that way even without legal designation. And her boyfriend crossed boundaries he wasn't willing to violate. I appreciate it. But no, why not? Because you're building a life, career starting, relationship developing. Last thing you need is a 61-year-old biker living on your couch. It wouldn't be the couch, it would be a bedroom. And you're not just some biker, you're family. The word family kept appearing. Lily had said it at Thanksgiving, was saying it again now, trying to create category that contained their relationship. I'll figure something out. Stubborn doesn't pay rent, neither does charity. It's not charity, it's what family does. They argued in circles, eventually reached compromise. He'd accept loan to cover expenses until disability came through, would repay once financially stable. Lily agreed, though both knew repayment was unlikely given his age and health trajectory. The money bought 3 months breathing room. Jax remained at Clubhouse, continued applying for jobs without success, fought with Social Security bureaucracy through appeals process that moved like cold honey. July brought another death. Hammer suffered massive coronary while working on his bike, dead before the ambulance arrived, 61 years old, same age as Jax. The funeral was small, Emma and Tyler, Michael and Lily, who'd driven up from Oklahoma City, Danny and a few old riders who'd known Hammer decades ago. They buried him in the same cemetery where Preacher rested. Standing at another brother's grave, Jax felt the mathematics of mortality. Preacher at 53, Hammer at 61. How much time remained measured in declining health and economic precarity. Emma approached after the service. Tyler stood beside her looking young and lost. Dad talked about you a lot near the end. Said you taught him what it meant to do right thing regardless of cost. That watching you sacrifice everything for Lily helped him understand what he should have done for me. I'm sorry I couldn't save him. You did save him, just not his body. You saved his soul, gave him model for being the man he wanted to be. She hugged him. Tyler did too. Then they left for a reception Jax didn't attend. He stood at the grave with Danny. Two old bikers watching their brother join the earth. We're the last ones. Danny's observation was accurate. Big Iron was down to 2 members. The club would die with them. August brought Lily's first day at Oklahoma Department of Human Services. She called that evening describing bureaucracy and caseload and the overwhelming scale of need that exceeded resources. I have 87 active cases, 87 children in situations ranging from neglect to active abuse. I'm supposed to investigate and assess and determine safety with 30 hours per week. The math is designed to fail. I know. But I'm going to try anyway, because that's what you taught me. You try even when systems are designed for failure. Her determination reminded him why he'd done what he'd done. This woman with her 87 cases was the 6-year-old he'd saved. The connection between past action and present consequence couldn't be clearer. September brought second denial of disability claim. Same reasoning, insufficient documentation despite Jax submitting everything requested. The appeals process would continue. Eventually he'd probably win. Might take years. Meanwhile, money from Lily's loan was exhausted. Rent at Clubhouse was 3 months overdue. Danny couldn't cover it alone. The building's owner was patient, but patience had limits. October brought eviction notice for the clubhouse. 90 days to vacate. By Christmas, Big Iron Motorcycle Club would cease to exist as a physical location. Jax and Danny spent evenings sorting through decades of accumulated materials. Tools and parts and memories rendered into categories of sell or store or discard. The archaeology of their lives examined and reduced. Lily's drawings came down from the wall. Jax rolled them carefully, added them to the tube with his copies. The chronicling of her healing would move with him wherever he ended up. November brought Thanksgiving, second anniversary of the legislation that bore partial fruit. Implementation was happening slowly. Some states embracing reform, others resisting. Progress measured in incremental improvements rather than revolutionary change. Lily invited him to dinner again. This time he accepted, had nowhere else to be. No clubhouse to retreat to, no brothers to share solidarity with. Just himself and the slow dissolution of everything familiar. Dinner was at Michael's parents' house in Tulsa. Large gathering of extended family. Jax was introduced as Lily's guardian. Close enough to truth for strangers who didn't need complicated history. He sat at a table with people he didn't know discussing topics he couldn't contribute to. Career advancement in real estate markets, in children's academic achievement, the ordinary concerns of middle-class stability. After dinner, Michael's father approached. Older man with the comfortable bearing of someone who'd navigated life successfully. Lily told us what you did for her, what it cost you. That's remarkable. Just did what needed doing. Most people wouldn't have. They'd have looked away, let someone else handle it, but you paid the price for doing right. That's rare. The conversation was kind, but highlighted Jax's displacement. These people lived in a world where sacrifice was theoretical, where doing right didn't cost 13 years and economic destruction. He left early, told Lily he was tired. She hugged him extra long, pressed an envelope into his hand, told him not to open it until he got home. Inside was a check for $5,000. Note attached in Lily's handwriting. This isn't loan, it's payment for the life you gave me. Please take it. Please let me help the way you helped me. Jax stared at the check. $5,000, enough to cover months of expenses, maybe long enough to outlast disability appeals process. He called her. She answered on first ring. I can't accept this. Yes, you can. You gave me everything. Let me give you something back. This is your money, savings from your new job, and I want to use it to help you the same way you used everything you had to help me. They argued. He insisted he'd be fine. She insisted he needed help. Eventually, he promised to think about it. Knew he'd deposit the check because pride was expensive luxury he couldn't afford. December brought the final days at Big Iron Clubhouse. Jax and Danny packed the last items, turned off utilities, locked the door for final time. The building would be sold to pay debts. Big Iron Motorcycle Club would exist only in memory. They stood in the empty garage. Oil stains on concrete marked where bikes had rested for 30 years. The wall where Lily's drawings had hung showed cleaner rectangles where frames had protected paint. 30 years. Danny's voice carried weight of accumulated history. 3 decades of brotherhood and purpose, ending not with dramatic conclusion, but bureaucratic necessity. Could have been worse, yeah. Could have been nothing. Instead, we mattered. At least once we really mattered. They left separately. Danny to his apartment, Jax to temporary housing in a rooming house that accepted tenants with poor credit and criminal records. The room was 12 by 14 feet, shared bathroom down the hall, window overlooking alley where dumpsters congregated. Not home, just shelter while he figured out next move. Christmas came. Jack spent it alone. Lily invited him to Oklahoma City, but he declined. Claimed illness, though truth was depression that made social interaction unbearable. New Year arrived with the same arbitrary significance as previous years. Jax marked the occasion by depositing Lily's check. Accepting help felt like surrender, but survival required flexibility. January brought third disability hearing. Different judge. Jax presented documentation of deteriorating health, back problems limiting mobility, arthritis preventing fine motor work. At 61, his body was failing in ways that precluded employment. The judge was sympathetic but bound by regulations requiring specific medical evidence. Requested additional documentation from physicians Jax couldn't afford to see. The circular logic was maddening. February brought call from Senator Richardson's office. The legislation had been in effect 1 year. They wanted to feature Jax and Lily in press conference, highlighting successful implementation. Jax declined, told them to feature Lily. She was the success story. He was just the cost. March brought letter from Social Security Administration. Disability claim approved. Retroactive to date of application. Check for back payments enclosed. Monthly benefits would begin immediately. The amount was less than he'd earned working, but enough to afford modest apartment and basic needs. At 62, he was officially too broken to work. The designation felt like relief and defeat simultaneously. He found one-bedroom apartment in complex that didn't run background checks. Moved in with possessions that fit in 2 boxes, plus the tube of Lily's drawings. Hung them on walls of the new place. Familiar images in unfamiliar space. April brought unexpected visitor. Tyler Davis, Emma's son, now 10 years old and taking art classes. He'd asked his mother to bring him to see Jax. They sat in the small apartment while Tyler studied the drawings with the same intensity he'd shown at 8. Grandpa told me before he died that these drawings taught him about healing. I didn't understand then. I think I'm starting to now. What do you understand? That broken things can be fixed, not the same as before, but functional in new ways. The insight was sophisticated for 10. Hammer had raised Emma right. Emma was raising Tyler right. Cycles changing direction through intentional effort. Tyler pulled a folder from his backpack. Inside were his own drawings, abstract representations of grief following his grandfather's death, pain rendered in color and shape. My art teacher says I use art like therapy. I think that's what Lily did too. Jax studied the drawings, saw genuine talent emerging. Also saw healthy processing of loss. Tyler would be okay. The knowledge brought comfort. May brought visit from Lily. She'd been working at DHS for 9 months, already exhausted by impossible caseload and systemic dysfunction. But persisting because quitting meant abandoning children who needed advocates. She sat on a secondhand couch drinking coffee from mugs that didn't match. Looking older than 24. The work aged people who cared. I keep thinking about what you said, that the math is designed to fail. You were right. We're set up to process cases, not protect children. The paperwork matters more than the kids, so why stay? Because sometimes I can actually help someone. Last week, I removed 3 siblings from home where father was dealing meth. Got them placed together in good foster home. That's 3 kids who might have a chance now. She paused, stared into her coffee like it held answers. I think about how many Lilies are out there right now, being hurt while systems process paperwork. And I wonder if I'm making any difference. You are. Every kid you help is difference made. Every case you don't give up on matters. Did saving me make difference? Beyond just me individually. Lily's question cut deeper than she probably intended. Jax considered honest answer. Legislation passed that might prevent some future cases, but 47 victims before you didn't get saved. And kids are still falling into rubies, so the math is complicated. But I'm alive, and I'm trying to fix the system. That came from you saving me. Yeah, that's difference made. They sat in comfortable silence, two people connected by trauma and healing, by choices made under pressure, by surviving in a world that hadn't made survival easy. June marked 18 years since Lily had walked into Big Iron Garage. Jax marked the anniversary privately. No ceremony. Just acknowledgement that his life had divided into before and after that moment. July brought news that Agent Kim had been promoted, heading the FBI's task force on crimes against children, building on work that had started with Ethan Cross' investigation. She called to thank Jax for his testimony, said it had launched career trajectory she'd never anticipated. More ripples from one June afternoon. More evidence that actions echoed forward in ways impossible to predict. August brought Lily's engagement. Michael proposed during vacation to Colorado. She called Jax first after calling her parents. Wanted him to know before a broader announcement. Will you walk me down the aisle? I know David will too, but I want you both. The father who raised me and the man who saved me. The request touched something Jax had been protecting. He cried on the phone, didn't try to hide it, just let emotion happen. I'd be honored. The wedding was planned for following June. Year away. Time for Lily to finish planning while managing caseload. Time for Michael to complete medical school requirements. Time for Jax to save enough from disability to buy a suit that fit properly. Fall arrived with the cooling that suggested winter's approach. Jax's apartment became familiar through repetition. The second bedroom remained empty. He'd thought about renting it out, decided against it, preferred solitude to negotiating shared space. Danny visited weekly. They'd have dinner and talk about nothing important. The friendship that had sustained them through decades adapting to new circumstances. Big Iron was gone, but brotherhood persisted. October brought call from Tyler's art teacher. The boy had created series based on Lily's drawings, interpretations rather than copies. The teacher wanted to display them in school gallery. Needed Jax's permission since original work was private. He agreed. Drove to the elementary school for opening reception. Found Tyler's work displayed alongside artist's statement explaining inspiration. Saw how one child's healing had inspired another child's art. Another ripple forward through time. Emma approached during reception, looking tired but content. Thank you for being part of Tyler's life, for showing him that broken people can still do meaningful things. Your father showed me that first, and you showed him. That's how it works. We teach each other. November brought second Thanksgiving at Michael's family home. Jax was more comfortable this year. Recognized faces. Participated in conversations. Almost felt like he belonged. Lily announced engagement during dessert. Her ring was modest but genuine. Michael's parents expressed appropriate enthusiasm. Plans were discussed. Guest lists considered. The ordinary machinery of wedding preparation engaging. After dinner, Lily pulled Jax aside. I've been thinking about my vows, what to say, how to honor everyone who got me to this moment. You'll be in them, the man who gave me a future when I didn't have one. Don't make me cry in front of strangers. They're not strangers. They're family. Your family too now. The casual inclusion continued, Jax accepting it incrementally, learning to exist in social structures he'd never inhabited before. December brought quiet ending to difficult year. Jax spent Christmas with Danny. They exchanged no gifts, just presents. Two old bikers who'd survived when many hadn't. On New Year's Eve, Jax sat alone in his apartment. The television played coverage from Times Square, crowds celebrating transition from one arbitrary point to another. Collective delusion that calendar changes mattered. But maybe they did. Maybe marking time helped humans process continuity, find meaning in sequence. His phone buzzed at midnight. Text from Lily. Happy New Year, love you. Grateful every day you didn't look away. He texted back. Love you too, kid. Grateful you're thriving. The exchange was simple, but it contained everything that mattered. She was alive. She was building life worth living. His 13 years had bought her this moment and all moments following. The cost had been everything. The return was one life saved and ripples forward through time. Legislation protecting children. Tyler's art inspired by Lily's healing. Agent Kim's career focused on pursuing predators. Lily's work helping kids the system failed. None of it erased the cost, but it justified the payment. Jax looked at the drawings on his wall. 14 images chronicling 12 years of healing. Evidence that broken things could become functional in new ways. At 62, he was too old and too poor and too broken to do much beyond survive. But he'd done one thing that mattered, made one choice that changed trajectories. Sometimes that was enough. The new year stretched ahead, promising nothing beyond continuation. He'd wake up each morning, manage declining health, exist on disability that barely covered expenses, visit with Lily when schedules aligned, maintain friendship with Danny until one of them joined Preacher and Hammer. Not the life he'd envisioned at 20, but the life his choices had created. And within those choices was one moment of absolute clarity. A 6-year-old walking through garage door on bare feet. 3 words that demanded response. I need help. Everything after had flowed from that moment. Rescue and arrest, trial and prison, 13 years lost, legislation passed, one life saved. The mathematics remained complicated. But sitting in his small apartment, surrounded by evidence of healing he'd enabled, Jax understood something fundamental. The cost of doing right was real. So was the worth. And in the economy of meaning, that had to be enough.